Hey, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk to you today about the obstruction of truth, and this is going to deal with probably, in my mind, one of the greatest obstructions of truth is translation. As we all know, words mean things, and God gave us His Word. He gave us the Scriptures, and He wrote down truth so that it could be absolute and final and without question. And yet, of course, He gave it to us in the Old Testament, or in the first part of the Scriptures. He gave it to us in Hebrew, and then in the second part in the New Testament, He gave it to us in Greek. As English readers and speakers, we are, at least initially, at the mercy of our translators. And I guess the question is, can we trust our translators? Was there any ulterior motives involved in the translation that we're using? Because getting from, and now we're going to just specifically talk about Greek, and we're specifically, working on the Study Bible project. And one of the important things is to accurately obtain definitions of Greek words and subsequently of English words, so that we understand what the Greek word meant and we can convey it as best and clearest, closest way possible into English. And the trouble that I grew up with is that I was King James, and not just King James only. And it wasn't just a translation of preference for our splinter of Baptist denomination, but it was enforced translation, so that all others were discarded, and they were all in error. And so that's a great hindrance if the translators of the King James Bible had any bias and if they had any ulterior motives. Now, I'm not trying to speak necessarily evil of all the many scholars and high churchmen who were involved in the translation of the King James Bible, but we do have to ask ourselves, were there circumstances, was there an environment that placed restraint and placed a bias on them as they translated? And without question, if we look at history, number one, of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and the Translation Committee, and King James himself, who authorized this new translation, we will see that there was extreme religious and traditional bias. And the way I found that out wasn't through history. And it wasn't even in consulting other versions, because I was King James only. But to consistently read and compare words and verses in the King James Bible, and I began to find error and inconsistency and issues, which led me eventually away from a King James only position. And in fact, I'd come to see that King James was actually, the King James Version actually became in a great way an obstruction to the truth. And so just a slight background that we can understand. By the way, we have a book. I have a book on this, the KJV, 400 Years of Bondage. And I go over all the historical and textual and translation problems, with the King James. I had to write that as a way to settle my own understanding, having come from a King James only background. We'll put that in the links below if you're interested in this historical and textual translational information. But King James, we have to understand he was not only the king of England, but there was a church state in England at the time. And they were merged and married, a Babylon of sorts, where the head of the government, King James, the king, was also the head of the church. He was the head of the Church of England. He was the head of the Anglican Church. And so the translators of the King James Bible, it's funny now that I would come to learn these things, because I viewed and understand the King James Bible as some kind of champion of a translation for Bible believers and those who were sort of outside traditional structured, maybe Christianity. And lo and behold, I find that it was the translation was made in a hotbed of high church structure, the Anglican Church. So all the translators were high churchmen of the Church of England. And so as a result, on purpose, the King James Bible was a propaganda translation, because there were already English translations. There's Tyndale and Wycliffe and, and the Geneva Bible. There were already translations in English. But King James wanted he wanted a Church of England translation that would fortify Anglican doctrine. So the King James Bible is a religious translation. It is an Anglican translation. It is an ecclesiastical translation. In fact, many maybe our viewers and readers don't understand this, but again, we go over this in the KJV 400 Years of Bondage. But King James, through his emissary there on the committee, they formed 15 rules in the translation of the King James Bible. And it's that governed and controlled how the translation would take place. And rule number 3, and I'll just read it for you, the very first phrase of it. The old ecclesiastical words are to be kept. So the third rule of translation is we have to keep old ecclesiastical words in place. We can't alter them. I say we, the translators, couldn't do that. Now, I'll give you 2 kinds of examples. And then we'll be done with this segment here. The first is examples of Anglican ecclesiastical words that are preserved in the King James Bible. In other words, King James wanted the readers, more importantly, with a lot of illiteracy, he wanted the hearers to hear their religious words of their denomination. He wanted to reinforce those things. So here's the ecclesiastical words that were demanded to be kept: bishop, pastor, apostle, deacon, church, presbytery, and the list goes on. And so when the scriptures are read, it would seem to the listener especially, and the reader, if someone could read, that, wow, we are in the right religion. We Anglicans are the truth bearers. And then the other example of is words of Anglican theology. Not just ecclesiastical words, but theological words that support Anglican doctrine. And I'll just go over a whole list of these: baptism, Easter, hell, everlasting, forever, eternal, eternity. If you want to know how these words made it into Scripture, even though when we understand Sheol and Hades, and even though when we understand eon and eonian, you say, how is it even possible that these words got translated in these ways? Because they got translated to support Anglican high church ecclesiastical institution and government. And little wonder we have no idea what's going on. In many of these cases, the words aren't even translated, they're transliterated. They're simply taken straight out of the Greek and Anglicanized. They're turned into English words, English spelling of Greek words. And you want to talk about obscuring truth, that can obscure truth. Now, a lot of times we refer to Greek words, and we do so for the opposite reason, to show that, that the words being used are wrong words, But so we can see how these obscure the truth. And it's a deliberate act by a political governmental leader and by a religious leader to clearly, he says, I will have, in fact, we have a book on that, by the way, which we can put in the links below. I will have one doctrine, which is a history of the King James Bible. And his whole point in translating a new Bible is that he says, I will have one doctrine and one discipline. And what does he mean by that? In England, we're going to believe one thing. We're going to believe Anglicanism. We're going to believe the Church of England. And this translation is going to shore that up. We're not going to get any people wandering off by themselves into any other insights or truths. So you got to understand that's the way. And really, I would say almost all other English translations since King James has sort of used the King James as a base to work from. And so you start off working from error to try to, and the main emphasis becomes make it easy to understand, easy to read, easy to understand. Now, surely, we want truth easily understood, but there's something bigger at play than easy. And it's truth, clarity, precision. And so then come along the literal translations, and how I thank God for the literal translations, Rotherham, the Diaglott, the Concordant, and, on and on. There have been great strides made in literal translations. But it doesn't take long to realize when you're even looking at literal translations, there is still a tendency not to abandon words that are set in Christianity, words that are set in religious tradition. So one of the goals that we have, a main goal that we have in the Study Bible project that we're busy working on, is freedom from ecclesiastical translations. Freedom from religious translations. Freedom from traditional translations. To truly get back to the Greek word. And as odd as it may sound to the reader or our viewers, and how much it might fly in the face of all that's been taught before, we are making, it is our goal to make every attempt to as clearly and precisely and accurately and honestly convey the true meaning of these Greek and Hebrew words. I thank you all for joining us on this wonderful journey to unobscure the truth by non-ecclesiastical, non-religious, non-traditional understandings and definitions of words. And we certainly appreciate all the wonderful comments we've been receiving by people who say, "Hey, I'm right there with you. I'm following you. This is all resonating with me." Those are meaningful. And then, of course, there are those who say, "Yeah, not only that, but hey, I'm stepping up to help you," and are wonderful contributors, and we thank you for that. That allows us the freedom and opportunity to work on this study Bible project.